Hello guys, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you are well. Today I'm going to be talking about, in my opinion, the most helpful tool in photography. And the reason that I think it's the most helpful is that we can use it during every step of the photographic journey, right from taking the image through to the final print. I can't honestly think of another tool that delivers this much help throughout the whole photographic process. So this amazing tool is called the Histogram, and today we're going to be taking a look at it and how to properly use it during the shoot and the edit to really make the most of our photographs. So let's dive straight into it. So if you're not familiar with the histogram can be displayed on the back of your LCD screen on your mirrorless or DSLR camera. Now my cameras also support it in the viewfinder as well, and that's really helpful. Some older DSLR cameras don't support a live view histogram, but on some you can check it retrospectively by looking at an image you've already taken and then checking that image data. The beauty of a live view histogram is that it changes as you move your camera, giving you a live reading, of the tonal values within the scene. So every time you move it, it will change. So how do we read the histogram and why is it so important? Well, the histogram shows the tonal range of the composed scene. So it's in a graph format and it helps us to measure and assess the exposure within that scene. Let's take a look at the histogram here. Like any other graph, we have an X and Y axis. The X runs horizontally and the Y vertically. The vertical Y-axis measures the number of pixels within the scene that fall within a particular luminance value. The horizontal X-axis measures the tonal range with pure black on the left and pure white on the right. The tonal range graduates from left to right, with the mid-grey falling around the centre of the graph. Here my camera is pointing at a black cloth, and as you can see my histogram is completely bunched to the left, showing that all of the pixels are completely black. Here my camera is pointing at a white screen and we can clearly see that all of the pixels are stacked on top of each other to the right hand side of the graph. If we point the camera at a black cloth and a white light, the graph will show half of the pixels bunched on the left and the other half on the right if it's split evenly. The graph allows us to see how the camera is displaying tones. As we adjust the exposure of our image, the graph will change, telling us if something within the scene is becoming over or underexposed. So how can we use this to determine our exposure when we're out in the field shooting? So the histogram is my go-to tool for assessing my exposure when I'm out shooting, as it allows me to see firstly if any part of the scene is under or overexposed. It also allows me to assess if I can increase my exposure to help me gain more shadow detail without introducing noise into the image. So you might have heard the term exposed to the right. Well, this can really help us to gain more detail in the image by pushing the histogram to the right. We'll be overexposing that a little bit. Like I mentioned before, this allows us to capture more details in the shadows with less noise when we start editing. Now, if we decide to push the histogram to the right, we have to make sure that we don't hit the end of the graph, otherwise we'll start to lose details in the highlights. So we need to make sure that we stop just before the end of the graph. Exposing to the right does have its advantages, but to make this work, we need to understand how we wish the image to look. For example, if we take an image of a black piece of card and expose it to the right, it's no longer going to be black, is it? The further we take it to the right, the more grey it becomes. So before pushing your image, my advice would be to decide whether it actually benefits the scene that you're shooting. Quite often, the right exposure is the best option. Exposing to the right is a valuable asset to have in your locker, it really is, but you really need to be sure it really benefits the image that you're taking. The histogram is also very valuable for assessing your scene prior to making a decision about bracketing or using a filter. If you see that the histogram is touching both the left and the right end of the graph, then the dynamic range of the scene in front of you is exceeding that of the camera. If you prefer not to have either your highlights or blacks over or underexposed, then a bracketed exposure of say 5 images at one-stop increments may allow you to capture all of the detail. To assess how many stops you need to under or overexpose, simply find your base exposure and increase your exposure until the histogram becomes free of the edge. Do the same for the other end of the graph and you'll find out how wide to make your increments during your bracket. It makes this process really quick and easy. With practice, you'll be able to read the scene and know exactly how you wish your histogram to look. I often solely rely on the histogram when shooting in bright conditions, as it can be a little bit difficult sometimes to actually see the LCD, especially if the light's reflecting off it. Also, if the tripod's low to the ground, you might not be able to use your viewfinder. So again, using the LCD and the histogram really helps. I also have my screen brightness on my camera turned up, as I'm often shooting in bright conditions, and for this reason what I'm seeing on my screen perhaps doesn't represent how the raw file will actually look when I've got it back loaded into the PC. One thing to watch out for is how your camera is interpreting the histogram when you're shooting in RAW. So my camera here shows a JPEG preview in the rear LCD, but obviously the JPEG will look different to my RAW file. JPEGs use the camera to process the image and output a photo ready for use. Quite often a JPEG will be more contrasty, more saturated, sharper, and often it'll have a colour profile attached to it. The histogram displayed in the rear LCD on many cameras will be based around that JPEG file, that the camera's outputting, and not the RAW file. Some cameras have the option of displaying a natural live view, and in most cases it is this that's the best representation of how the histogram will look with the finished RAW file. Let's take a look at this example here. Here we have my Fuji X-H1. It's set up to shoot RAW to one SD card and JPEG as a backup to the other. Like most cameras, you can select a profile which tells the camera how to process the JPEG. For example, Nikon has standard, neutral, vivid, landscape, portrait. Fuji has film simulations such as Vero and Astia. When we have a film simulation or a profile selected, the histogram will display how the tones fall within that given profile. Now the issue with this is that Vivid or Velvia, for example, are way more contrasty and saturated than the actual RAW file is, meaning the histogram on the camera screen will look completely different to that of the actual RAW file when we get it back and load it into the PC. The problem with this is we may interpret the histogram when we're using, say, Velvia and be underexposing or overexposing our image, and we can have a completely different outcome when we get the image back to Lightroom and take a look at it. My advice would be to select natural live view if your camera supports it. This means that even though your JPEG will still be recording the attached profile, say Velvia or Vivid, the view on the LCD will be overridden with a natural view, and a more realistic histogram will be displayed. If your camera doesn't have natural live view, then you could choose a very flat JPEG profile and maybe make a few tweaks to it if you can to make it as flat as possible, and do a few tests to see whether the histogram on the back of your camera matches that of the RAW file. So here in Lightroom we can see a histogram displayed at the top of the editing panel, but we can also see the same graph in our curves too. The great thing about this is that we can see how our edit affects the tones within the image as we make our adjustments. The more we use the histogram in the edit, the more familiar we'll become with how we wish our image to be exposed when we're out shooting in the field. Let's look at the histogram here, as there's a few things that we can do to help us with our edits. Firstly, we can toggle on and off the clipping warnings here. Having these selected will show us when we're over and underexposing the image. Secondly, we can drag the histogram around by clicking and holding and dragging the graph. See how the sliders move as we drag the histogram. Now, of course, we can see the histogram change as we move the sliders too. This helps us to see how the tones are changed as we make our adjustments. And this really helps us to understand if we're over editing our image. We have the option of showing information under the histogram too, such as our camera settings. Like I mentioned before, the tone curve also displays the current histogram. By manipulating the curve, we can see how this affects the graph. This is another great tool for adjusting things like contrast within the photo. Very similar to the tone curve, we can find the histogram graph displayed in Photoshop under the levels adjustment layer. Here we can adjust many things such as our white and black points. The histogram has a numerical range running from 0, which represents pure black, on the left hand side, to 255, which represents pure white on the right. We can adjust the white and black points by shortening the ends of the graph. And this is a really easy way of making an off-white become pure white and also a dark grey become pure black. It's a very powerful tool indeed, but I actually prefer to use the tone curve adjustments in Lightroom. It's also worth mentioning here that the histogram is available in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, and most other software such as Capture One, for example. I really can't think of another photography tool that is more helpful to the photographer than the histogram. It really changed my thought process when it was first integrated into modern cameras. It really did. I can't think of anything else more helpful. If you guys have any more information that I haven't mentioned here in this video, please be sure to drop it down in the comments section to help others. Many thanks to everyone that supports this channel by liking, subscribing and sharing these videos. Your support is very much appreciated. Also a massive thanks to everybody over at the Photographers Clubhouse. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, I'll leave the link for that down below. It's a place where we're coming together, a small community of like-minded people to help each other inspire and grow as photographers. There's already a ton of my extra content over there, so if you fancy checking that out and supporting this channel, yeah, like I mentioned, your support will be very, very much appreciated. Anyway guys, thank you once again, and I will see you next week.